The hills of rural Vermont held a kind of quiet that you didn't just hear, you felt it. Especially in late autumn, when the trees stood bare and the wind rustled through them like an old man flipping the pages of a book he'd read too many times. At the end of a long dirt road, nestled between two maple-covered hills, stood a farmhouse with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked whether someone sat in it or not. It had belonged to Walt Harris, a retired mailman who had lived in that house for over 60 years. Walt was the kind of man who still used a pocket watch and called his coffee Joe. Tall, with a lean frame hardened by years of shoveling snow and splitting wood, his silver hair was always tucked under a faded Red Sox cap. He wasn't one for many words, but when he spoke, folks listened, because every sentence sounded like it had been aged in oak and seasoned with experience. Now the house was quieter than usual. Walt had passed just 3 weeks before, and the place felt it. The old weather vane no longer spun in rhythm, and even the wind seemed hesitant to blow too hard. His family had gathered to help sort through what was left behind: his daughter Beth, her husband Tom, and their 7-year-old daughter Maggie. Beth, with her father's sharp jaw and her mother's kindness, had always felt torn between city life and these woods that raised her. Tom, a school teacher, quiet but good-hearted, spent more time watching than talking, and when he did speak, he chose his words carefully, like a man afraid of wasting them. But the real soul of the place now was a dog named Buck. Buck was a purebred bloodhound, and though her muzzle had gone gray, and her long ears drooped lower than they used to, there was still something noble about her. Her coat was a rich reddish-brown, her eyes sagged but saw more than most, and her nose, well, folks used to joke she could sniff out a lie before it left your mouth. She'd been Walt's shadow for over a decade, trailing behind him through woods, fields, and across the frozen ponds in winter. Maggie had taken to Buck right away. Maybe it was the way the old dog tolerated her chatter or the way she'd nudge her gently when Maggie got too quiet. They made an odd pair, one at the start of life, the other near its end, but somehow it fit. Buck, who had barely moved since Walt passed, would wag her tail, just slightly, whenever Maggie came into the room. On that particular morning, with the weak sun pushing through gray clouds, Maggie sat cross-legged on the front porch, her hand resting gently on Buck's back. She whispered something into the dog's floppy ear. No one knew what she said, but Buck gave a slow blink, like she understood every word. And maybe she did. The attic had always been a mystery to Maggie. It smelled like old wood and mothballs, the kind of place where sunlight came in only as thin, dusty beams through a cracked window pane. The stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed them that afternoon, chasing a feeling she couldn't name. Her parents were in the kitchen with Grandma June, sorting boxes of old paperwork and faded photographs, but Maggie's heart pulled her elsewhere. She had wandered past the attic door a dozen times since they'd arrived, always curious, always hesitant. But today was different. Buck had followed her to the foot of the stairs, something she hadn't done in weeks. Maggie looked back. The bloodhound stood there, ears forward, tail still, eyes fixed on her like she was waiting for something important to happen. With one last glance, Maggie pushed open the attic door and stepped inside. It was a world frozen in time. There were shelves lined with coffee tins full of nails, old fishing rods, a cracked bowling ball, and boxes labeled in Walt's blocky handwriting: Christmas lights, Beth's trophies, do not toss. The air was thick with the smell of time, of lives lived, paused, and tucked away. She found it in a drawer of an old wooden workbench near the window. An aged leather dog collar, stiff but still intact, with a metal nameplate that had nearly rusted over. Next to it, a folded scrap of paper. Maggie unfolded it carefully. It was Grandpa Walt's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. For Buck, only if she's ready. W. That was all it said. She turned the collar over in her hands, her small fingers brushing along the nameplate where faint letters read Buck. It wasn't her current collar. This one was older, worn thin along the edges, like it had been used and removed more than once. It was special. Maggie hesitated, then gently slipped the old collar over Buck's head. The dog didn't resist. In fact, Buck lifted her head a little, like she'd been waiting for this moment. What happened next made Maggie's breath catch. Buck stood up, fully. The dog hadn't moved like that in weeks. Since Walt passed, she'd barely risen to eat. But now she was alert, focused. Her ears twitched. Her nose lifted, and she sniffed the air with deep, deliberate pulls. Then she turned and walked, slow, steady, confident, toward the back porch and out into the yard. "Mom!" Maggie called, rushing after her. "Buck's moving." Beth appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, followed by Tom and Grandma June. Buck didn't wait. She walked past the vegetable garden, past the woodshed, down toward the edge of the trees where the old trail began. She paused only to look back once, as if to say, "Come on, now." Grandma June blinked, stunned. Then her lip curled into a small smile. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "Looks like Walt's not quite finished with us yet." And just like that, the journey began. The trail behind the house wasn't on any map. It was more of a memory than a path, worn smooth not by boots or tires, but by years of quiet steps and faithful paws. Walt had walked it nearly every day with Buck, through every season. Snow, mud, leaves, rain, it didn't matter. It was their route, their rhythm. Now, with the old collar resting around her neck like a key in a lock, Buck was walking it again. Maggie stayed close behind her, one hand gripping the strap of her denim overalls, the other holding a small flashlight even though the daylight was still strong. Her parents followed at a distance, carrying thermoses and light jackets, not yet sure what they were walking toward. And Grandma June, cane in hand, insisted on coming along, her pace slow but steady. The forest greeted them like an old friend. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the fading light made golden lace out of the trees. Squirrels chattered above. Leaves crunched underfoot. But the family barely spoke. They didn't want to interrupt whatever this was, this moment, this movement, this quiet mission that Buck seemed to be leading. Every few yards, Buck would stop, sniff the air, and glance back at them. Not in confusion, but almost as if to say, "You're doing just fine. Keep coming." About 20 minutes into the walk, Maggie spotted something nailed to a tree just off the path. Weathered, warped by years of sun and rain, but still legible. A wooden sign. Handwritten, in Walt's unmistakable scrawl, "Keep going." Beth put a hand to her mouth. Tom stepped closer, brushing away a vine that had curled across the edge. "He planned this," Tom murmured. "Walt, he planned this whole thing." Grandma June gave a dry laugh, the kind only grief could twist into something tender. "Of course he did. That man never liked leaving without giving one more piece of himself." Buck continued down the trail, her pace never rushed, but purposeful. At times she veered slightly, choosing narrower forks over wider ones, as if guided by scent, or memory, or both. They came to a clearing where the sun spilled through like honey. In the center was a flat stone, an old sitting rock, Beth remembered from childhood. Buck stepped up to it, sniffed around, then sat, tail curling neatly beside her. At the base of the stone was another sign, smaller this time. "Rest here." "Good job." There was a moment of silence. Not the awkward kind, but the reverent kind. The kind where even the birds seemed to know not to sing. Tom unscrewed the thermos and poured coffee into the lid for Grandma June. Maggie sat cross-legged beside Buck, stroking the dog's ears. "Where do you think she's taking us?" Maggie whispered. Beth didn't answer right away. She looked into the woods ahead, where the path dipped gently out of sight. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I think your grandpa wants us to remember something. Or maybe, to find something." And so, after a short rest, they followed Buck into the trees once more. The trail narrowed as they moved deeper into the woods, the canopy thickening overhead. Shafts of sunlight broke through where they could, spotlighting patches of moss, fallen branches, and the occasional glimmer of a spider's web. The air grew quieter, softer, like the forest itself was listening. Buck led them with certainty, her steps never wavering. Every now and then, she'd pause, nose to the ground, and circle a particular spot before continuing. Maggie followed close behind, eyes sharp and curious, as if she could feel the weight of memory hanging in the branches above. The first stop came at the old oak tree with the gnarled base, twisted like it had once tried to pull itself from the earth. Buck stopped there, tail still, and sniffed around the roots. Maggie crouched to look closer. "Mom, what's this?" Tucked into the hollow of the trunk was a rusted toy car, one of those old metal ones from the 60s, with chipped red paint and working wheels. Beth stepped forward slowly. Her face softened. "I gave that to Dad when I was 9. Told him it was for his desk collection." She chuckled, her voice catching. "He must have moved it here after I left for college." Tom put a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. There wasn't much that needed to be said. They moved on. Next came the old stone wall, half crumbling, covered in moss. Buck paused there again, this time near a log just beyond it. Maggie spotted something shiny wedged under the bark. She pulled it free, a small tin harmonica, dulled with age. Beth gasped. "He used to play that every night," she said. "Badly. But somehow it always made the house feel warmer." Tom smiled. "He tried to teach me once. Said I blew into it like I was scaring off a bear." Grandma June let out a soft, wistful laugh. "That harmonica saw us through some hard winters. He played it when your Grandpa Sam passed, and again when your mother got sick. It wasn't music, but it was comfort." They continued. Further down the trail, Buck took a sharp turn toward a small cedar grove. There, half covered in leaves, stood a wooden sign nailed to a young maple. The bark had grown around its edges, but the carving still showed clearly. W+J, 1965. Grandma June stepped closer. Her hand trembled as she traced the letters with her fingertips. "That was the year we got married," she whispered. "We carved it right after Walt built the first fence out here. Said the trees would remember, even if we forgot." There was silence again, but not the hollow kind. This was the silence of presence. Of roots that held memory tighter than any photo ever could. Maggie looked up at her mother. Why did Grandpa hide all these things? Beth crouched beside her, brushing a leaf from Maggie's shoulder. "I don't think he was hiding them," she said gently. "I think he was planting them. So when we needed to remember, they'd be here, waiting." Buck gave a soft woof. It was time to keep moving. By the time they reached the lake, the light had begun to soften, turning the water a shade of silver blue that shimmered with the last warmth of the day. The trail opened into a quiet clearing, the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. The air was still. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shore. Buck stopped near an old bench, its wooden slats faded and warped with age. Walt had built it decades ago. Beth remembered helping him carry the planks, her arms barely long enough to hold both ends. They'd sat there every summer after dinner, just the two of them, watching the sun set behind the ridge. Now Buck circled the bench, then sat with a long, slow exhale. She looked up at Maggie and let out a low, contented huff. Something was here. Maggie, dirt on her knees and pine needles in her hair, began gently clearing leaves from around the bench. Her fingers brushed against something hard. She pushed away the soil and uncovered a flat rock. Underneath it, nestled in a shallow hollow, was a small, dented tin lunchbox. She looked up, wide-eyed. "There's something here." Tom helped her lift the box from the ground. It was heavier than it looked, sealed with an old belt buckle strapped around it. The leather was cracked but still held firm. Beth undid the buckle with care, as if opening something sacred. Inside lay a bundle of aged photographs, a few dog-eared postcards, and a small brass key. On top of it all was a folded piece of lined paper, yellowed at the edges. Beth opened it slowly. Walt's handwriting was still firm, though slightly uneven. "If you've made it here, then I'm smiling real wide from above. I couldn't take you with me, but I hope this helps you hold on to me a little longer." Below that, a short list of memories. Fishing with Beth, age 10. June's birthday picnic, 1978. Buck's first day on the trail, muddy and glorious. The bench, the view, the quiet. The letter ended with, "The keys for the attic. But not the one you've seen. Look behind the wardrobe. That one's got the real stories." Tom turned the key over in his hand. "There's another attic?" Grandma June blinked. "I'd forgotten all about it. Walt used to say it was his quiet space. I never asked." Beth held the letter close, pressing it to her chest. She looked at the photos, young Walt with June in front of the farmhouse, baby Beth asleep on his lap, Buck as a flop-eared pup staring straight into the lens. None of it was gold or jewels. But it felt like treasure. As they stood there, watching the sun sink lower behind the trees, Buck rested her head on Maggie's lap. They didn't know exactly what waited in the hidden attic. But somehow, they all felt it. This journey wasn't over yet. Back at the farmhouse, dusk settled in like a warm blanket. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting a soft glow over the weathered steps. The family moved quietly through the house, as if not to disturb the air that now felt different, lighter, almost expectant. Buck followed them in, tail gently swaying, paws patting softly across the wooden floorboards. She seemed more alert now, her movements steady, her eyes keen. Maggie walked beside her, one hand resting gently on the old leather collar. Beth stood in front of the wardrobe in the upstairs hallway, the tall, mahogany one that had always been just a bit too heavy to move, the one her father had told her wasn't worth the trouble. But now, those words rang differently. With Tom's help, they slid the heavy piece of furniture aside. Behind it, set flush against the wall, was a narrow door with a small, brass keyhole. "Would you look at that?" Grandma June whispered, her voice caught between disbelief and awe. He really did hide something. Beth stepped forward, heart pounding, and slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a click, the kind that echoed a little louder than it should have. The door creaked open, revealing a short staircase that rose steeply into darkness. Tom grabbed a flashlight. "Guess we're going up." At the top of the stairs, they emerged into a space no one had known existed, tucked beneath the gables, the ceiling low, the beams exposed. Dust floated like snowflakes in the beam of the flashlight. The room smelled of cedar, ink, and old books. And it was full. Stacks of journals lined the far wall, each dated in Walt's careful handwriting. Old shoeboxes overflowed with letters, birthday cards, and black and white photographs. There were maps, some hand-drawn, of the land surrounding the house. One corner held a reel-to-reel player and a box of labeled tapes. Another held a series of carved wooden figurines, tiny versions of everyone in the family, even Buck. Maggie's eyes sparkled. "It's like a secret museum." Beth stepped into the room, brushing her hand across a shelf lined with dog tags, campaign medals, and a folded flag. She recognized it instantly, Walt's military keepsakes, which he'd never spoken much about. Tucked behind the flag was a worn VHS tape. In thick black marker, it read, "For Maggie." She held it up, stunned. Did he really make this for her? Tom turned it over in his hands. Looks like he knew this day would come. Back downstairs, they set up the old VCR on a dusty TV Walt had kept in the den, mostly for watching baseball. Everyone gathered on the couch, Buck curled up at Maggie's feet. As the screen flickered to life with the static hum of old tape, there he was. Walt. Smiling in that shy, sideways way he always had, sitting in the very chair Buck now claimed as her own. "Hey there, kiddo," he said. "If you're watching this, then Buck did her job." Walt's voice crackled through the speakers, soft and a little shaky, like the man himself. He sat with his hands folded on his lap, wearing his favorite red flannel shirt and the old fishing hat Maggie had once tried to steal for dress-up. The image was grainy, but the warmth in his eyes came through clearly, as if he were right there in the room. "Now Maggie," he began, "you're probably wondering why a dog led you through the woods to a rusty lunchbox. But let me tell you something, some stories are better told slowly." Everyone chuckled gently. Even Grandma June, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief she claimed she didn't need. "I made this for you," Walt continued, "because one day, you'll grow up. And when you do, you'll need reminders, not of who I was, but of who you are. This land, this home, the silly old man who fixed radios and burned toast, it's all part of you now." The room was still, the kind of stillness that hangs heavy but sweet, like the air before a summer rain. Walt's video played on for 15 minutes, full of small stories. How Buck once fell into the pond chasing a frog, how Beth had once tried to run away but only made it to the edge of the barn, how he had secretly written love letters to June every year and hidden them in the attic. "Check the second box from the left," he said with a wink. "You'll find M." They did. Beth sat cross-legged in the attic an hour later, reading one aloud. The letter was dated 1973. In it, Walt described the exact moment he fell in love with June all over again, watching her laugh in the rain, hanging clothes that would never dry. The language was plain, but heartfelt. Every word was a thread connecting a life well lived. Tom flipped through the journals, careful handwriting on every page, thoughts Walt had never spoken aloud. He wrote about missing his own father. About worrying he hadn't said enough to Beth when she left for college. About the joy of seeing Maggie born and the quiet ache of knowing he wouldn't see her grow up. The journals weren't polished or poetic. They were better. They were real. There was a kind of quiet joy in the air, the kind that comes not from grand revelations but from piecing together a life in small, tender details. A napkin sketch. A grocery list with a heart scribbled next to milk. A Polaroid of Buck as a puppy with the words "Day One, Good Girl" written on the back. Downstairs, Buck rested her head on Maggie's knee. The old dog let out a low, satisfied sigh, as if to say, "We've done what we came to do." And perhaps she had. Because what they'd found wasn't just a hidden room. It was a legacy, preserved not in monuments or money, but in moments. In memory. In love passed down gently, like a story told by firelight. The next morning dawned pale and cool, with a soft mist hanging over the hills like a curtain waiting to be lifted. The farmhouse was quiet. Inside, the family slept late, worn out from the emotional weight of the day before. But not Maggie. She was already on the porch, bundled in a hand-me-down sweater 2 sizes too big, waiting. Buck stood beside her. The old bloodhound was slower now. Her legs ached with age, and her eyes had dulled with time. But that morning, something stirred in her, a final burst of purpose. As Maggie clicked the leash onto the old collar, Buck lifted her head, ears twitching. Together, they made their way back to the trail. They didn't go far. Just to the bench by the lake, where the water still shimmered faintly with the light of a rising sun. Maggie sat down, her legs swinging above the mossy ground, while Buck settled in at her feet. "I think he knew," Maggie whispered. "I think Grandpa knew I'd need to hear his voice one more time." Buck didn't move, but her tail gave the faintest thump. Once. Maggie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded drawing, a stick figure family with a lopsided dog. She laid it gently beneath the bench. "For you and Grandpa," she said. "So you don't forget us." Then she leaned down, pressing her cheek to Buck's forehead. "Thank you for finding him." The wind stirred the leaves gently, as if offering a reply. Years later, Maggie would return to that farmhouse as a grown woman, her own daughter tugging at her hand, eager to see the woods she'd heard so many stories about. The trail was still there, fainter now, but visible if you knew where to look. And the bench by the lake, though more weathered, still stood firm, watching the water with the same quiet patience. Inside the house, Buck's collar hung in a small shadow box above the mantel. Next to it was a photo, Walt, with Buck at his feet and young Maggie beside him, both beaming, both unaware of how quickly time would pass. In an old notebook on the hallway table, Maggie had written a message for her daughter. "Some treasures aren't gold or buried deep. They're stories, left behind on trails, waiting for us to walk them." The day Buck passed, she had done so quietly, curled beneath the window where the sun hit just right. She hadn't needed words. Her journey had already said everything that mattered. Walt's voice, his letters, his quiet wisdom, those lived on in the pages they found, the stories they told, and in the way Maggie never forgot to slow down and listen. As the sun dipped low over the Vermont hills and fireflies began their quiet blinking, Maggie sat once more on the porch swing. She closed her eyes, and in the hush of twilight, she could almost hear it again. The soft jingle of a collar. The echo of footsteps on a well-worn trail. And love, carried forward.